Okay, the live stream is already up on the fan page. We can start the debate now. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Jack. So hello, everyone. My name is Shireen. I'm the head volunteer, and I'll also be taking care of this room. So could I just quickly check if both teams are here? Team China proposition.
Hi, we're here. Thank you so much.
Thanks. If you could turn on your camera, that'd be great. Team Netherlands, I can clearly see you here. Are all the judges here? Eric Kazadi?
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you. Kyle Go?
Yes, I'm here.
And Anna Saint?
Yep, also here.
All right, thank you very much. So just a very brief introduction. I'll be timekeeping the debate, and I'll be posting timestamps at 1, 7, 8, and 8:15 for substantive speeches, as well as 3, 4, 4:15 for reply speeches. At the end of the speech, I'll also indicate the total duration of that speaker's speech. Secondly, it is discouraged for all active members of the debate to keep their cameras on at all times. This means the main speakers of the debate as well as the judges. This is just so that I can still monitor you and see that you're in the call, and that in case you drop off, I can attend to you if that happens. Third thing, non-active members of the debate, i.e. cautious observers and team managers, you're advised to keep your cameras and microphones off at all times so as to not interrupt the flow of the debate. Next thing, in the event someone does drop off the call, I will stop the clock and interfere with the debate just to let everyone know of that technical issue. Yeah, without further ado, I'd just like to ask the chair if you would prefer to do the transition to speakers yourself, or if you'd like me to do it.
I can do it. That's fine.
Okay, yeah, no worries. So without further ado, TIO to Team China and Veel Success to Team Netherlands. I'm sorry if I said that wrong because I don't speak Dutch. I tried my best. All right, let's start the debate. I call the Prime Minister to open the House.
Thank you so much for that display of globalism.
You're welcome.
Tyranny is being beholden to a contract that you never signed. We say that for people to build a society that they are proud to be a part of, the Constitution needs to be a living, breathing document. 3 things I'm going to prove in this speech. Firstly, why amendments are insufficient in the status quo. And secondly, why constitutions need reforms to be A, more representative, and B, more modern. Firstly then, what is our model? We would say that these constitutional conventions would happen less often than an election cycle, but probably more frequent than a generation. If they want an exact window, we would say it's probably somewhere between the periods of 20 to 30 years. Secondly, the people framing these new constitutions or framing revised constitutions would consist of bodies of legislatures all the way up from the federal to local level, judges, executives, all members who make up a government. They will propose, and if they're reasonably popular, they will agree upon and hand a new minted constitution for it to be ratified. Thirdly, the ratification burden is probably going to be the same as amendments on both sides of the House. For example, in the United States, that would be 2/3 of the Congress and 3/5 of the states. If it isn't ratified, then it goes back for further revisions. This isn't a debate about the model, but I think that this is pretty clear. Firstly then, why are amendments insufficient in the status quo? 3 important reasons. Firstly, because the perceived sanctity of constitutions in the status quo make it incredibly hard to create structural change. There's a societal belief that constitutions are holy, and it shields legitimate discourse. To say that whenever there is a mass shooting in America, we never have a discussion about whether or not it is actually right to enforce things such as gun ID laws, because of the fact that there's an intrinsic resistance to changing the Constitution or removing the Second Amendment. But on our side of the House, the comparative is that we employ higher standards to the Constitution. We say that it isn't just you have to have a really, really huge reason, a huge social impetus as to why we should change the Constitution, but rather you need to be able to actively defend the amendments and the clauses within the Constitution. So it isn't just a thing about allowing it to subside forever, but allowing it to be actively defended. But secondly, there exists a political trade-off in the status quo, which means there's little to no attention placed by politicians in terms of changing the Constitution. There is no incentive to push amendments because politicians are inherently short-termists and they have other issues to care about. Their voters probably won't care if they can get a constitutional amendment through in the next 8 to 10 years. And because of the fact there's a collective action problem, they find it incredibly hard and daunting that it's probably infeasible for them as a singular politician to be able to push through an amendment or be able to push through some sort of proposal for that amendment. On our side of the House, what we do is we force discussion. We guarantee that at some point there is a reviewing and checking mechanism to say that even if there is no political incentive that exists, this is something that's important for the procedure of a country, and for that very reason there is constant checks and balances. But thirdly, it's that the amendments in the status quo are incredibly tunnel vision. They look at specific clauses, they look at specific things, they look at issues rather than a comprehensive investigation of the Constitution on a whole. That means that when you have structural problems in the Constitution that make up not just a singular clause, but about the structure of the government as a whole, for example, the Electoral Congress, these things never get looked at because they don't encompass the narrow scope of what happens in the status quo. On our side of the House, we have a much more comprehensive vision to look at. Before I go into why the Constitution needs to be more representative, I'd be happy to take a POI.
In case that these conventions deadlock on particular issues, would the current provisions be preserved or would the current provisions be lost?
Yeah, we think that maintenance is like a perfectly reasonable thing to happen on our side of the house if there's a conclusion to come by. There is nothing that should be changed. Firstly, why do constitutions need to be more representative? What is the intrinsic point of a constitution? It is the framework that establishes the social contracts that governments and citizens abide by. It establishes the values that your country support. It establishes the laws and procedures that establish a trade-off between individuals and the government. Implicit consent, the tacit consent that you have in the status quo of being born into a country and paying taxes and following laws, is simply not good enough for the high burden of proof the government has to meet in order to make sure that people are consensually agreeing to that contract. Because at the point in which you give up your intrinsic rights to own, for example, land or to have, for example, anarchy, then that is the point in which there needs to be a much more active agreement from the citizens to the government, when that relationship needs to be much further cemented, because it is such a high burden of proof point in which you take people away from the state of nature. Why then do we have better generational consent on a whole? The first is that it's continuous. Every single contract has a term. Every single contract has an expiration date. The reason why this is the case is because values are constantly updating, because individuals do not foresee what they're going to care about in the next 10 to 30 years in the same way that a country cannot foresee what their values will be in the next 50 to 100 years. So to that extent, then, it is incredibly important that every single person who is born into society at some point in their life has the ability to have a say in how the government works, virtually by voting in their congressman and legislator who support these sorts of bills and support these type of proposals. To that degree, then, we better uphold that generational consent when every single person, no matter where you're from, no longer has to rely off of the arbitrary framings of some people who were born 200 years before you. But secondly, it's demographics. The people who wrote the constitutions are just implicitly, like, ascriptively different from you. That the vast majority of constitutions were written by white men. And we understand in a cosmopolitan society right now, there is many different types of demographics that all have to be represented, and they can't be represented ancestrally through people who don't look like them. So the impact of this is to say that they still have things such as like the 3/5 compromise in America that talks about slavery being a part of the government. To that extent, then, it's incredibly illegitimate for a Black person to be a part of a country in which their governmental constitution literally regards them as property. But that's why it's incredibly important, then, that these shifting demographics are represented by new legislative bodies, by new judiciaries, by new executive branches. But thirdly, it's that people's ideologies update, and to that very degree, that needs to be represented. I think this is enough to win us this debate on face, because the fact is, the principle of a constitution is what, first and foremost, to uphold the rights of citizens, and if those people get a say in it, then we win on that clash alone. But secondly, why do we make the Constitution more modern? The characterization here is incredibly clear. The constitutions are intrinsically archaic because they are written hundreds and hundreds of years ago. They're much more likely to be conservative because the values then were less progressive. They're less likely to be outdated because people back then literally could not predict the types of social contexts that we live in now. Why do we make this better, and why are these issues so important? Firstly, because we incorporate a modern context of modern issues into the new signings and new framings of the Constitution, because framers could not foresee the changing context, which is why, for example, when you look at the Second Amendment, it might apply for if you have muskets, for example, but the dynamics are completely changed when you talk about automatic weapons like AK-47s and how that changes the relationship between a militia and a government. When you look at the right to search and seizure, for example, that might be incredibly clear in a world in which the only thing you own lived inside your house, but now when we have a digital space, how much right do you have to your own information and how much right do you have to your own privacy in that digital setting? These terms all need to be updated, because in the absence of that updation, you get an incredibly ineffective constitution on a whole. When we have new concerns that we have to worry about, things such as global terrorism, things such as cybersecurity, these fundamentally question the nature of the state and what the responsibilities are in the protection of individuals. To that degree, then, these new issues need to be taken into consideration when looking at the way that we frame our society on a whole. The comparative is, on their side of the house, what they do is force broad interpretations of the Constitution. It means they give the judiciary a lot of power in this sense, because of the fact that there is incredibly inspecific clauses in the Second Amendment about how we should deal with the modern context of firearms, for example. To that degree, then, it is incredibly unrepresentative, because it's 9 individuals who you never voted for, who you never elected, who have no incentive to please the popular demand. But secondly, it means that they get to make their decisions in the ivory tower based off of what they feel the current situational context is, without us us having a say in it. But secondly, it's also the semantics of it, right? The fact that the Constitution is written in incomprehensible language sometimes, and you cannot resurrect Thomas Jefferson and ask him what he meant. The fact that the Second Amendment literally changes depending on whether or not you thought a smudge was a comma is in and of itself a terrible thing to do, because at the point in which we're worrying about the individual decisions that people made back then, these grammatical errors that change the way that we live, that's an incredibly arbitrary metric to base a society off of, which is why we don't allow those individual errors and those individual mistakes and clauses to be cemented forward, but rather we individually come to agreement every generation to say what is best for them. We would say that tyranny is allowing a contract you never signed to be beholden to, incredibly proud to propose.
Checking that the panel is ready. Thank the first proposition speaker for that speech. And now to begin the case for the opposition, welcome Owen. Yeah.
Hi, can I just confirm that I'm audible?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Laws are about existing subjective preferences that can change with the times. However, there are objective values that need to be upheld regardless of the majority's preference, which is why it is critical we have longevity in constitutions that cannot easily be overthrown by the temporary power of radical politics. We've reached a point in time where the vast majority of constitutions are very liberal in their representation and protection of human rights. On side proposition, you risk the one stable legal barrier we have that prevents the blatant disregards of human rights, the one certain legal barrier protecting the freedom in our democracy to prevent tyranny, the one irrefutable barrier we have to ensure all laws passed are egalitarian and non-discriminatory, no matter how populist the elected government is. The solidity and longevity of a constitution is instrumental to ensure it is taken seriously, to create an equitable society and protect the vulnerable who are not always represented in the majority's opinion. That is what you risk losing on-side prop when something meant to last forever becomes something flippant, undetermined, and up to the roll of the dice. A couple points for rebuttal before I get into my arguments that are largely comparative. Firstly, on their model, I find it incredibly defensive that the PM says that this is not a debate about the model, because this model is crucial to ensure the one legal barrier of a 30-year period, right? Their model seems like the perfect recipe at best for a deadlock, at worst for political chaos the media can make a spectacle of. Laws that are only valid for 4 years already create mayhem in the status quo. Imagine how much tension and polarization will arise from something that will last 20 to 30 years when it's something that's constantly happening. In my first argument, I will show why these constitutions are already good enough, which means at that point, you only wake sleeping dogs on their side. Next, they say the Constitution should be more representative. Panel, I'm going to show you why this is already representative, but more importantly, isn't this specific niche stuff done through laws? They have never shown why it is vital for this to be constitutional. They have never shown why the Constitution hinders current progressive policy. The reason they haven't done this is because progressive policies in the status quo benefit from the solidity and egalitarianism within the Constitution, like bodily autonomy to maximize the right to abortion and egalitarian principles that allow LGBTQ+ members to sue people when they're discriminated against. More importantly, they never proved why people who will make these constitutions every 20 years will be equitable representative people. Because just like to clarify, we are in a situation where populism is on the rise, the right wing is growing. I don't understand why, like, they cannot suddenly claim that the people who will make this are going to be progressive people who will create good policies. In fact, I find it risky to leave it up for the roll of the dice within those 20 years, whether or not you're in a political majority that elects Trump or in a political majority that elects Biden. Because that is something so flippant, you shouldn't leave it up to that. Now, moving into my first argument on why most constitutions are good as is, and on their side, you achieve nothing but risking the loss of what we already have. But firstly, why are the vast majority of current constitutions very egalitarian? 4 independent mechanisms to this. Firstly, historically, all constitutions have been written by liberals. There are structural reasons as to why this is true. Constitutions emerge in newly established democracies. That means they are written after the overthrow of absolute leaderships like monarchies or like dictators. Think about the US founding fathers or Thorbecke in the Netherlands. The ones establishing the constitutions are the ones who were successful in disempowering absolute leaderships in favor of democracy. They are the ones who believe everyone is equal, everyone is worth the same, and everyone should receive the same opportunities. Given the context in which democracies are formed, their clauses are there to ensure the equitable treatment of everyone. That means people who shape the Constitution on our side are more likely to be representative than arbitrary people on their side. For example, the European liberal revolutionists of 1748 across Europe, liberals took control and created broadly egalitarian constitutions. Think about Spain, Prussia, Belgium, a bunch of places. Second independent mechanism. In the historical context of new states where a political elite has just been disempowered, there was simply not an elite that could simply empower themselves because no one had the political control to do so. Thus, to actually have a constitution be passed, these founders need to appease many groups and thus end up with broadly egalitarian laws that are representative. But thirdly, given the high threshold of changing a constitution on our side, the only clauses that are changed are the bad ones that have allowed democracy to fail. They represent how we have learned from our mistakes. For example, after the Holocaust, Germany established eternity clauses to ensure the same thing doesn't happen again. Bad clauses lead to bad outcomes, which is why they are already eradicated, given these constitutions are ever growing. Anything new you implement has not gone through that growth and that checking barrier, which is why they're more likely to be worse, especially when they don't have the time to mature or grow because they're constantly being changed. Fourthly, these constitutions are built up over time to represent universal moralities and not subjective preferences that come and go with the momentum in the political landscape. Therefore, they are much more a product of universal morals that apply throughout time and not only what is convenient in a certain snippet of time. The reason Trump was never able to blatantly discard minorities the way he would have liked to is because of clauses in the US Constitution that states everyone gets equal rights. On proposition side of the House, if the fixed change period happens during a radical presidency with a political right-wing majority, you risk losing important constitutional values that ensure human rights are followed. Think about every time you elect a Supreme Court justice, but it happens to be during a red presidency, right? Especially with the rise of populism and growing polarization and animosity, it is vital we do not allow the momentum of radical movements to override the one barrier we have that overthrows non-egalitarian policies. Given these constitutions are good, it's good that they are difficult to change. It's good they can't be overthrown, and it's good we cement them in our society. Every LGBTQ plus lawsuit has leaned on this constitution to gain legitimacy, to be enacted, to receive justice. Through these reasons that firstly, the people who set up constitutions are egalitarian people. Secondly, the flaws in bad constitutions are organically amended and improved through time, which you lose on their side when it's that short term. But thirdly, that they are inherently more representative of universal moralities like human rights, rather than what would be decided at arbitrary times in politics. How does this affect this debate? Firstly, their arguments rely on the assumption that most constitutions are bad. Given we've proven they're good, their case has no tangible merit. The better the constitution is now, the less you achieve by changing it. Secondly, given the constitution is currently creating positive impact, you risk losing that, in the chat please, on-site prop when you can allow temporary surges in like xenophobic political majorities to overturn good clauses we already have. Those risks of unwriting are not likely to be worth it. Moving into my second substantive on how constitutional development over time is crucial. What does this look like? We think in the current amendment structure, the Constitution adapts itself and improves itself, and more importantly, strengthens itself. This happens in a few ways. Firstly, the institutions centered around it. Think about parliaments, courts, executive officers. They define themselves as well in relationship to each other. There's only so much a constitution can do when it comes to dividing power in the government or limiting the power of each office. The strong division of power is largely set up by limited constitutional provisions, but by court precedent, internal legislation, and unwritten principles. For example, in the US Supreme Court Madison case, in which they established the principle of judicial review, i.e. the right and duty of federal courts to review the constitutionality of laws. This was a power not defined or constrained in the Constitution, but one that developed over time and is now central to keeping other branches in check. Secondly, because their provisions of the Constitution also develop as courts interpret them and set important precedent. This is why many countries in the provision that was passed as a means of establishing equality between all white property owning men is now the provision on which equality for people of all genders, races, sexual orientations is based. That means even if the Constitution itself doesn't change through amendments, people interpret them differently, which is vital for setting precedent. For all these reasons, we urge you to oppose.
I'd like to thank the first opposition speaker for that speech. Now to continue the case on the proposition bench, welcome P2. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but a gentle reminder for debaters to preface with how they prefer to receive POIs. Thank you.
Hi, can you see and hear me like this? Okay, great. For my entire team, POIs are preferred verbally, so you can just unmute your mic. Okay. It is arbitrary that in these 20 years I am elected and therefore I can shape the Constitution. But what is more arbitrary is that Thomas Jefferson happened to exist in 1776, happened to be born in a wealthy family, happened to own slaves and plantations, and therefore shaped politics forever. So yes, arbitrariness exists on both sides of the house. The difference is arbitrariness shape our politics forever on their side. So if one mistake is made, it shapes our politics forever. If 1/3 compromise existed, that means we are needing to take so much more effort to overthrow it and prove that African Americans are not just property. Versus on our house, we know arbitrariness existed, therefore we check it every 20 years. That if you made a mistake and your political opinions are wrong, at least you're subject to the whims of the people and you're subject to the scrutiny of the next constitutional convention, and that's how you counter arbitrariness. There are 3 questions I want to answer in this speech. Firstly, a comparison of the comparatives. Second of all, why we better politics in society, and lastly, why we are principally winning this debate. Firstly, on the comparison, because basically their argumentation is that longevity is good. 2 things. 1, most things are universal morals as they characterize, which means these politicians wouldn't go through the unnecessary process of opposing it if it's something that's universally recognized. Like, for instance, we should have votes. 1 person, 1 vote. Everyone has an equal voice. Everyone gets free speech. If these are such universal morals as they characterize that are good, then no politician would go through the effort of going against something that's widely recognized and change the Constitution. So the very backbones they talk about, like electoral processes, won't be messed up on our side of the house. But 2, if longevity is so good and the original Constitution is so well written, they need to tell you why they support amendments in the status quo or proposing laws to counteract things in the Constitution. Because if they think it is so perfect and like permanence is the most important thing, why do they also have mechanisms to change the Constitution? They need to resolve that contradiction on their side of the house. The next thing they talk to you is that there's going to be a tyrannical abuse of the system where politicians like Trump are going to shape politics. There are a few things I want to note. Firstly, that is a contradiction to their case because they shape politics and like characterize politicians in vastly different ways. On one hand, on their house, politicians wouldn't be abusive at all and will use the legal system to forward positive change. Versus on our side, they're suddenly so abusive that they're going to institute undemocratic measures the second they're given this chance to change. So they need to choose if politicians are good or bad on their side of the house. But 2, they don't respond to the 2 accountability mechanisms that came out of our model. Firstly, that is a very, very balanced bipartisan board, and therefore it's not going to be abused by one side when they politically win. Because this includes the legislature, which currently the House is held by one party and the Senate is literally held by the other party. They include the judges, which is literally split on a 5-4 mark in the status quo, and they include the executives as well. So in aggregate, it balances out the 2 parties' influences, and therefore no political advantage is going to be too great. But 2, the threshold of passing something is so high. It's not just a simple majority. It's an overwhelming majority in the status quo where it's a 2/3 majority, and therefore it's not going to be abused just because you won one election. But moreover, what they don't talk about is the fact that like they characterize these constitutions as being liberal because these are individuals who overthrew the monarchies. Yes, they were liberal back then, but did they prove to you that they're still liberal right now? These are people who are okay with owning slaves, okay with writing the 3/5 compromise, and okay with saying women don't deserve a right to vote. Yeah, they were liberal back then compared to the monarchy, but even in the modern spectrum of moral window, they're way outside of this acceptable range, and therefore they shouldn't get to shape our politics. So the characterization that they were liberals back then doesn't stand against the sands of time that has passed for far too long. The second question is about why we better politics and society. Note how the only grounds they engaged us on is progressive policies. They don't even respond to everything we talk about how we better political processes like the Electoral College that is way too archaic. But let's first deal with what they talk about, which is progressive policy. What you need to do is compare who has more likelihood of change. Because what they do is they point to examples where there are certain interpretations currently based on the Constitution, and therefore they assume the correlation means the Constitution right now in its current form is the best form to create change. That is unproven. The simple example is of gender rights. Gender is not even mentioned in the Constitution. Roe versus Wade, which allows for abortion and contraceptives, is based on the right to searches and seizures, a very tenuous continuous and long link to this, like a very indirect justification for this policy. So that means this is a tenuous link that could be challenged by the right wing anytime, that it's easily broken down because abortion is clearly not directly justified by searches and seizures. Versus currently, if there's a constitutional convention right now, they're going to receive pressure from the social movements that currently exist, not just the ones that existed in 1776. And therefore, the hashtag Me Too movement will make sure that they make the politicians realize you have to include something explicitly about gender. That's where the link to Roe versus Wade is going to be something that's way more concrete. And it's about women and men deserve equal rights, and therefore it's unlikely to be overturned. So with regards to changes, likelihood and probability and permanence, we win when we get more updated constitutions in this sense that is influenced by social movements. But we already proved to you why their mechanisms of change all get better on our side of the house. They want to rely on the legislature. They want to rely on the judiciary. But the problem is when you only have one issue being voted in an amendment process, like the conservative senators are unlikely to swing and help you, because that means they're literally showing their devotion and commitment to the Democrats, versus they're more like a let things slide when it's an overall convention like revising and re-examining everything, because that means it's a necessary part of compromise, or they're hiding in a crowd and therefore they can like more easily sway that moral responsibility when it's not a tunnel vision of a single issue, and therefore let these conservative progressive policies pass. But secondly, there's a mechanism they do not rebut under this argument, which is discussion to get way better for all social movements, for all activists, for all progressive individuals. Because currently the right wing can easily say gun rights should be upheld because it was written in the Constitution, that abortion and everything just stay in a status quo, not get progressed because it's written in the Constitution. We don't push them further and demand for extra justification or actual reasons as to why they oppose for women having their choices. All they need to say is this document is very, very like holy because it's stayed the same since the foundation and histories of our nation, and because of the heritage, we don't need to explain to you anything else. We get rid of that sanctity when we like regularly revise this Constitution and show you it's a living document, which pushes the right wing to say more. This at least makes the left wing way more compelling and gets rid of a positive tool used by the right wing to shut down discourse with the left wing, and therefore discussions for progressive politics gets much better. There are a few things that I want to note. First of all, they don't address anything we talk about regarding politics. The fact that there are just archaic mechanisms that we don't question. The fact that the electoral college is just this way because that's the way things have been done. But right now, this is the difference on the two sides of the house. Amendments will only occur when there's an obvious glaring problem, but that is already too late. That means the glaring problems have already shaped our politics in a negative way. It's so much so that everyone feels it. Versus our side of the house, we upgrade the burden of the politicians. You can't just prove to me why something should be changed. You need to also justify maintaining something in these every 2 years. That even staying the same is something you need to rethink about. And like we make you think about it again and double check if this is what you want. And this is where we're more likely to keep good policies and get rid of the ones that are going to become glaring problems down the line. This is where we're going to become better because we upgrade the threshold of discussions for the right wing. We upgrade the threshold of maintenance and we better society as a whole. But lastly, even if you don't believe what we're saying about politics and progressive policies, we win in terms of the principle because this is a democracy and democracy is supposed to be run by the people. And on this house, they force people into a contract they did not consent to when they don't address my first speaker's argument regarding the consent of a social contract. The fact that you can't foresee yourself going into like 100 years of your life and predicting what's exactly going to happen to consent into a contract. The fact that your ancestors shouldn't be opting you into a political system when you don't even have the chance to shape the backbone of it as they characterize. Why are you forced to live in the society if you don't have control over the very definition of it? And lastly, the fact that demographics, such as the progressive demographics, are not even going to be things that are considered when the very framers in history are writing this Constitution. The fact that they don't know this would happen means they don't have the knowledge to write and represent you. This means you're forced into obeying something that you never even signed. You're forced to surrender your monopoly over violence and self-autonomy to obey laws, even though you don't know what was going to happen back then. You have no control over this process. That is why all contracts have a term of expiration, because you have to revisit the terms when you have better information and when you have changed as a person over time. They don't respond to that, which means they impose rules onto individuals and they get rid of the consent of the governed. Tyranny is when you don't justify upholding something and you just say it's the status quo and therefore it is correct. Tyranny is when you impose contracts that were never signed by individuals, and tyranny is when you don't allow people to shape the politics they live in. We're so proud to propose.
Thank the second prop speaker for that speech. Now to continue the case for the opposition, welcome the second op speaker. Yeah.
Hi, I'd prefer POIs in the chat, please. Thank you. Panel, proposition had two burdens in this debate. Firstly, they had to prove to us why current constitutions are so terrible that we have to rewrite the entire thing. But secondly, they had to prove to us why on their side of the house, constitutional conventions would then solve any of those issues they pointed to us. Now, they may have very nice rhetoric, but I think at the end of the day, they've failed to prove both burdens. Comparatively, I think we've successfully proven, number one, that these constitutions don't always need overall conventions, but secondly, that even in propositions world, this is only worsened on their side, given that you remove a lot of constitutional development that is crucial for provision. So before I move on into my substantives, let's look at what the proposition brought to us. They brought to us two main arguments. Firstly, this idea that amendments are just insufficient in the status quo and are hard to change. I have two responses. Number one, know that we've already told you, most of the time it is just unnecessary. The Constitution is something that is supposed to be timeless and reflect basic needs. The fact that they constantly point out these tiny little changes that need to be made already sort of proved on our side of the house that it's unnecessary. You need to go through the complete process of a constitutional convention, rather that oftentimes most of the ideas are things that deserve to be preserved and are things that are timeless. But secondly, constitutional conventions being easier to change is just not necessarily a good thing. They keep on saying, we keep it modern, we change it every 20 years, but they've never proven to us any of the benefits. Note that amendments take time because you have, for example, things like committee hearings that takes a lot of time because you want expert opinions, etc. The reason why it takes time is because you have proper procedures in which you are fundamentally changing the principles that everyone follows within your country. We think these are things that don't need to change every now and then, and there are good reasons for that. But onto their second argument, how they're just more representative. The first layer they give to us is this idea of how this of the social contract and how it's unrepresentative. I'm just genuinely unsure why they are better to fulfill the social contract on their side of the house, given that it's still a small group of politicians that are likely to be elite writing this sort of new constitution. I'm unsure how this is any more representative, and given that it is still going to be arbitrary forever if it's always still this random group of politicians writing it every couple of years. I think especially given that if you didn't elect those politicians ever, if you didn't ever consent to them writing it, I'm not sure why they're better able to fulfill that social contract. But secondly, on their idea of how this is written by very elite people in the past and aren't representative now. I think sure, it may be written by very elite people, but oftentimes the principles are still timeless. Sure, many years ago, the Constitution was made for white men who owned property, but I think as time has progressed, the fact that these fundamental basic rights still went on, but now just applied to different people, regardless of your race, regardless of your sexuality, regardless of your religion. But the fact is, it's still preserved, and things like the freedom of speech is still something that everyone deserves, even if it was only targeted to a small group of people. The fact that we've adapted now and changed means something. So now, what did we prove to you in our speech? Our first speaker, Anna, told you two things. Number one, the constitutions are already good. We gave you structural analysis as to why this was. We told you there are trends of liberalization, oftentimes liberalism, in which these constitutions are created, but also that you just need to cater to a wide group of people when you're writing it. So oftentimes it is something that is already very equitable and nice. But even in their worst case, we told you we have checks and balances such as amendments. The fact that most of the times these are things like universal moralities means these are just fundamental ideas of equality. And we think that's fair. What did they respond to? They said, firstly, if constitutions are so good, you just don't need amendments. I think this misses the nuances of our arguments, right? We told you majority of the times you don't need to change much given that they're already good, but that is especially the reason why you just don't need constitutional conventions. In their worst case scenario, in which you might have a subclause that is still somewhat problematic, I think that's something we could simply change with amendments on our side of the house. But the point is, this is generally good and it's just unnecessary on their side. But the second thing they said to us was, but constitutions are just problematic in general. I have a few responses. Number one, know that constitutions are not the only law in these states, right? So the enforcements are not always problematic. For example, the European Human Rights Convention can invalidate any European constitutions with inequitable clauses pertaining to human rights. That is to say, most of the time it's not invasive and it's just simply unnecessary that you need to go through this entire process of rewriting everything. But secondly, note that even if we debate on their grounds, it is just simply not worth it to change this. Political chaos is what you create. The fact that you prevent constitutional provisions and you weaken democracies are all things that are net harms on their side of the house, which is unnecessary given that on their side, the small changes you need to make are something that's so unimpactful. So then what was the second argument we told you? We told you that constitutional developments over time is crucial because provisions on their side of the house will just change much more, and therefore you have less checks and balances. But also, constitutions just get less strength when institutions know that they're going to constantly change. We told you what this means is that overall, you just lose out on these crucial developments that are needed for democracies. We never heard a response to this. I think this still stands. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Do you think it is likely that moderate Republicans would vote to repeal the 14th Amendment that gives equal rights to all citizens in America?
Look, here's the problem with that, right? Sort of, if you're talking about problems that would never change on either side of the house, I'm just not sure why you would fix that either. But I think what's unique about their case is when you do make constitutional conventions, you just create political chaos in which you lose out on the fundamental checks and balances we currently have. You lose out on the fundamental basic ideals. And overall, it's just unnecessary to begin with. So what is our third argument? We tell you this creates a dysfunctional media spectacle. We say currently, when you compare conventions to amendments, they're very different in terms of the attention they get. We say constitutional conventions attract far more attention. Even in the 18th century, when a constitutional convention was held to establish the Bill of Rights in Philadelphia, that was already a huge media spectacle. Given nowadays, in the current day and age of sort of like social media and digital, we see the size of this is going to be a far bigger spectacle. Note that this is a group of politicians gathering together from all over the country, and therefore realistically, the convention will not take too long, a couple weeks probably at most. But this is also something in which you're making big changes, where you fundamentally change the principles that a country governs with. We say comparatively, amendments gather far less attention because these are changes made over a period of time that is usually quite a long period of time, meaning it is less exciting. But also these are committing hearings that just don't get attention because you involve a lot of experts and you talk a lot and discuss about these changes. We say what this is likely to create is a media spectacle on their side of the house. This is reporters waiting outside of your discussion room. This is cameras televising your decisions. This is media recording and writing down your every move. And we think the impact of this is twofold. Number one, simply just more political polarization. When the media make a spectacle, they tend to write the most eye-catching headlines and twist words so that the stories are shocking. We say this is likely to worsen the divides between two political parties or two sides, given that the media now forces themselves into this discussion, and therefore you're able to heighten a lot of the conflicts and tensions that already exist. But secondly, we say politicians start acting the way they want to be televised, not the parts they create, not necessarily how they can create the best constitution. So you pass things based on appearance rather than how it functions. Because note that if you stand against a group, you will be blamed and seen as controversial. If you vote with the group, you're just unlikely to be blamed. An example of this is the Stolen Valor Act, in which someone in the US wanted to pass a law that criminalized people becoming veterans. This clearly violated an individual's right to free speech, yet it was passed because politicians didn't want to seem unpatriotic. We think this is problematic on their side of the house when you constantly involve the media. This is something you don't get with amendments. I think we win this debate.
I thank the first proposition speaker for that speech. The second opposition speaker for that speech, and now call upon the third proposition speaker to conclude their substantive case. Yeah.
Hi, am I visible, audible, and may I begin?
Yes, all's good.
Okay, sounds good. Let me get a timer. Three clarifications at the top of my speech. The first thing I want you to note strategically is that a large part of their case is ununique. First opposition spends 3 minutes telling you why the original constitution written 200 years ago is good. Great. If that constitution is so good, then that constitution won't be changed at the convention. People will agree with it. The politicians will say, this is a good constitution. It's representative. Therefore, we want to maintain it. So even if the original document is good, we can have that benefit on our side of the house as well. But second, I think they confuse what this debate is about. If this debate isn't about the clause in the Constitution that says people have a right to vote or that people have equal protection under the law, the reason why for this is the case is twofold. One, those issues are nonpartisan. The Republican Party in the US is conservative, but they don't say Black people should have a right to vote, right? That's not what this debate is about. But second, given that you have a plurality of politicians, amendments against the most extreme policies won't happen on our side of the house as well. So this debate isn't about the freedom of speech, but rather it is about the more controversial parts of the Constitution. Those are like the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms in the United States, or the Eighth Amendment that used to be in the Irish Constitution, which banned people's right to an abortion. But thirdly, there's a contradiction in their case. Because on one hand, they say organic change is good. But on the other hand, they say that politicians are subject to short-term whims. If their case is true, and you believe their response to our case, which is that politicians are short-termists and that politicians will do crazy radical things, it's unclear as to why that they can stand for amendments and organic change on their side of the house as well. Two clashes then in this debate. First, in principle, which side is more democratic? And second, how do we better make the political process? No. First, which side is more democratic? They say that the original constitution is great because the founding fathers of almost every single country are liberal. Three responses. One, if it's great, then we can maintain it on our side of the house. Two, we think that we reject their premise that all founding fathers are liberal and that all revolutionaries are liberal. Conservatives can also found countries in the same ways that liberals can, right? If conservatives think that the status quo is too liberal, they can revolt for the same reason that liberals revolt, which is that the status quo is too conservative, right? Use their own example, the revolutions in 1848, right? The precursor to those revolutions in 1848 was the Age of Metternich, in which you had a conservative backlash towards the French Revolution, in which the European monarchs got together and basically said, we need to curtail future revolutions. So it just isn't true that all revolutions are liberal and therefore all constitutions are liberal. But third, and this is the most important response, is that the liberals that they want to talk about that wrote constitutions 200 years ago are incredibly conservative by today's standards. The reason why is because political beliefs and preferences change over time, right? We are exposed to more information, our opinions change over time. This is why the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson were slave owners, and this is also true in Ireland, for instance, in which the 8th Amendment prohibits a woman's right to an abortion. Because of their mechanism as to why constitutions were good 200 years ago is that they have to appeal to the broader members of society. That broad society 200 years ago was defined by white property owners. In the status quo, that broad society is defined by a plurality of people from different creeds, from different races, and from different ethnicities. So if anything, our constitution was more representative. In short, in their best case scenario, if this constitution is great, that constitution will be maintained through conventions. In their worst case scenario, if this constitution has problems in it, we're able to fix it on our side of the house. But let me now attack their counter proposition. Their counter proposition is that parts of the constitution are problematic, but instead they stand for organic change. Two responses. One, what I said earlier about there being a contradiction here. If you think that politicians cannot be good at a constitutional convention, it's unclear why politicians will be good when they do organic change on your side of the house. But second, this organic change, if you really want to talk about it, is empowered on our side of the house. Because on our side of the house, the organic evolution of the Constitution that they talk about is a guarantee, the point at which you have to renew the Constitution every 30 or 40 years at the Constitutional Convention. Whereas on their side of the house, there might be organic change, but there also might not be. Because Eddie tells you that politicians care about the short term. They care about passing laws. They care about imminent issues. They're not thinking about the Constitution in the short term, which means that the organic change that they talk about is empowered on our side of the house, and which we guarantee it by cementing periodic constitutional conventions. But here's a big tiebreaker in this debate. The tiebreaker in this debate is the one of representation. Because here's the thing. I am happy to accept that in our worst case scenario, politicians will get it wrong, right? That politicians might do stupid things to the Constitution. Insofar as that is the case, and insofar as politicians can also do great things to the Constitution, that tie and that deadlock is broken when you look at the question of representation. Because our status quo is a lot more representative than theirs. The point wherein politicians in the status quo have to pander to the interests of the voters in the status quo was in contrast, the people who founded the Constitution in the past did not have to pander to the voters and the interests of the present. And furthermore, I would also note that the people who vote Constitution weren't elected, right? They won a war, they weren't elected. So it's unclear why they had the approval of the people then as well, right? What this then meant is that even if you have bad change or even if you have good change, that is regardless because we have better representation on our side of the house. Furthermore, we also told you how the social contract is only legitimate on our side of the house in which people continuously sign and approve it instead of it being a once and for all generation. In conclusion, our system was more representative and therefore we ensure democracy. Second, on the political process, the first thing I want to do is engage with the second speaker argument. They say that will cause a media spectacle. That's an argument against everything, right? It's an argument against Supreme Court cases because they report on Supreme Court cases. It's an argument against elections because every election is a media spectacle. I would say that media spectacle isn't that bad of a thing because the media was designed to keep politicians in check. If the media is recording their conversations, politicians are likely to conduct their mannerisms in a way that is popular with their voter bases because the media is checking on them. Unclear as to why that is a bad thing. But they just don't respond to all the practical benefits we give you on the bench, right? The first thing to say is that even if change doesn't happen, you get better discourse on our side of the house. The reason why you get that better discourse is because the Constitution is seen as less salient and sanctioned on our side of the house. When the right to bear arms in the United States isn't seen as an entrenched right that is holy, but rather as something that is subject to constant debate and discussion. That is the point at which Republicans can't just say you should have guns because there's a right to bear arms, that's when they have to give you logical, concrete reasons as to why there should be a right to bear arms. And those reasons have to be given at these constitutional conventions. So even if there isn't change, you get a better political system, the point when politicians have to present arguments defending and refuting each part of the controversial constitution. Before I move on, yes, your POI.
In your world, how can you protect individual rights given that you don't have sufficient court procedures and legal certainty?
We can protect individual rights because in order for you to pass anything in a huge legislative body, you need the appeal of the vast majority of individuals. But like court procedures aren't exclusive to US side of the house as well, right? Like the judiciary can still exist on our side of the house. If they want to do things, they're able to like enact against that. But the other thing I want to know is what exactly is the comparative on their side of the house? Because on their side of the house, as society progresses, the Constitution becomes increasingly vague. So the right to free speech was written in a context in which the social media age did not exist. The right to bear arms was written in a context in which assault weapons can't kill a whole school of children, right? Therefore, these rights, because they're so vague, they leave the interpretation up to justices, which are sometimes good, but are also problematic because those justices were simply not elected. So yes, the justices in the Supreme Court did support Brown versus Board of Education, but they also supported Plessy versus Ferguson 50 years prior, which legitimized and legalized discrimination based on race in the first place. So justices might get it wrong, and justices might get it right. Those benefits are inconclusive and symmetrical to both sides of the house. But a unique difference is that one, we're able to check those justices in a democratic manner, the point in which the people as a whole are able to say yes or say no to the Constitution. So even if we don't get positive change, the system on our side of the house is a lot more democratic. But furthermore, we also tell you that those justices are inherently biased because those justices come from very elite backgrounds. Those justices, because you need to be rich in order to go to law school, that is also a reason why the minorities don't get represented in the justice system. Whereas in contrast, politicians need to cater to minorities because the vast majority of society today is not racist. In order to win an election, you need to cater to a coalition of people. So white farmers, black middle class, and the white middle class, right? That coalition of people you need to cater to is a reason as to why the Constitution is likely to be more reflective. Our side will get things wrong, and our side will get things right. But the reason why you vote for us is because you get the continued consent of the governed. I am very proud to propose.
I thank the third prop speaker, and now to conclude the substantive portion of the debate, welcome the third prop speaker. Yeah.
Am I audible at this volume?
Yes.
Perfect. I'd like my POIs in the chat, please. Just quickly make sure my phone doesn't lock during the debates. Yeah, okay, and timer. Panel, if Team China's model of bipartisan cooperation to create good law is the House of Representatives of the United States, I think that's a tough sell. The reality is that politicians are more so into showbiz and creating good law, that they pass bad laws regularly just because they think it makes them look good, given that most people don't know anything about the details of the law, and that therefore that is the sort of showbiz that they create within constitutional conventions. We say that's a very tough sell for Team China in this debate. Let me just give you First, we're going to make a strategic note and discuss their burdens. I'm going to outframe the principle in the debate, and then we'll talk the quality of constitutions in the status quo and the level of change of constitutions and the quality of change on either side. First, I want to make a strategic note. Team China wants to have their cake and eat it. They talk about the importance of representation, but still they say, well, if not a two-thirds majority agrees on scrapping a particular provision, then we're going to maintain it. They said in reply to my POI in their first speech. I mean, then you don't really want representation either, right? Then they say, well, we want to liberalize and modernize, but they still allow a one-third minority to prevent liberalization or modernization of constitutions. Again, they want to have their cake and eat it. We say that's a strategic error. We were very clear. We say most constitutions are currently good. We would like that they wouldn't be changed unless those changes are so uncontroversial that they would already happen in the status quo. We say we have a much clearer stance in that regard. Let's talk about their burdens. We say, first of all, they have to prove that constitutions are broadly bad in the status quo. Otherwise, they take an enormous risk for a very small potential benefit. And second, even if they prove that current constitutions are broadly bad, they have to prove that they have better change than we have at our side. But first, let's outframe their principle in this debate. They say that they want to maintain generational consent and that just tacit consent is not enough. Two responses. First, there's a model mechanism mismatch. If they allow a one-third minority of a generation to maintain constitutional provisions, then they have equally no generational consent as our side, because they only allow provisions of the Constitution to be scrapped if there's a 2/3 majority in favor of scrapping them. Therefore, I think that would at best be uncomparative. But we also don't think this is the standard we hold any set of laws to. We don't review treaties every 20 years. Regular laws are not reviewed every 20 years. Therefore, we're unsure what constitutions uniquely need this generational consent that no other set of laws need. That is something that they were unable to prove. Therefore, I think that principle falls out of the debate. Let's talk about the quality of constitutions in the status quo. The BM says that constitutions are often archaic because they've been written by old people. We say, on the one hand, that it ignores the historic context in which they were written, which I'll get to later. But second, it ignores the way that constitutions are written, in the sense that constitutions often write about principles rather than very specific provisions. So even if they aren't as specific, and in that sense not as specifically applicable to the status quo, the principles that underlie constitutional provisions often don't change. Often these are broadly good principles, and therefore we support that. Then we say in our LO that constitutions are broadly good because these constitutional democracies, the constitutions that were written, are often good because, first of all, they're often liberal authors. Notice these were people that overthrew a monarchy and created a constitutional democracy, because this debate takes place in constitutional democracies. Therefore, these are often liberals. Well, they say, well, but these people aren't liberal by modern standards. But that again ignores the way constitutions are written. Sure, they still believe in equality for all people. Yet they wrote clauses that ensured equality, and these principles were later extended to more people. Given that constitutions are written about principles, given that these liberal authors were broadly based on liberal principles, therefore we can simply extend those principles to more people. Second, we say that it was often, and that's something they were unresponded to, that after these absolute monarchs, etc., were overthrown, there was a lack of a political elite that could simply take power. That's why the Constitution had to be written in a way that broadly appealed, because the political elite was just defeated. There was no political elite to take power. Third, we say we can simply, the really wrong clauses can be amended. That's why broadly no wrong clauses exist anymore, because they have been long amended. We also say there's development over time. That's why we uniquely have more universal values than just the values that the current political majority agrees on. And fifth, there are simply treaties that even if a constitution has a really bad clause, there are broadly treaties that would take care of those. On the way up, I think this is the most important class, because one, it broadly marginalizes proposition case, insofar that if the current constitutions are actually quite good, then any potential benefit they have of making them better is much smaller than they frame it to be. But second, that it increases the inherent risks, I see your POIs, it increases the inherent risks of conventions, insofar that the moment that these constitutions are already good and you lose parts of those constitutions in those conventions because you create a media spectacle, that's the moment that you lose incredibly benefits that we have on our side. They say, well, but all these very important clauses are bipartisan, but I think it ignores the fact that there are broad political groups that don't actually agree. Sure, no one's going to reinstate slavery. That's not what the debate is about. But I think that there are important things about gender equality, etc., that are often written in constitutions that there's certainly not the sort of broad political support for in all countries. Therefore, we say that's a risk they take at their side. But I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so if constitutions are as good as you say, is that a value judgment you can make, or if it's something the people should vote on and decide over, which is uniquely manifested on all sides of the house?
Yeah, I think, okay, so here's the thing. I think they ignore, we say, if a majority of people want to reinstate slavery, we say that's wrong. We say constitutions uniquely exist to restrict the will of a political majority, because we recognize that representation is not the only value that should underpin our judgment of laws. Individual rights exist even if the majority believes that certain individuals are not entitled to rights such as freedom, such as equality. Therefore, we say that constitutions shouldn't be as representative of current political will, but that it's fine if they restrict. That's uniquely why we have a constitution rather than just only regular laws. Okay, let's talk about the change of constitution. They say that amendments are insufficient for two reasons. First, they say there's a belief of holiness around these clauses that prevents us from changing them. We say that we don't necessarily disagree, but we're actually seeing it's a good thing because it works both ways. Sure, there might be some provisions that they dislike that become harder to change because of the belief of holiness. Similarly, there are a lot of constitutions that we very much like. In fact, we say most constitutions are broadly good, that are more unlikely to be changed the moment there's just the belief of holiness. And then they say it's simply too much effort for politicians to change a constitution. Look, if there's an important amendment, obviously you're going to change it even if it takes effort because your path to popularity. And politicians can work together, co-sponsorship also happens with regular laws. Then we say, on the other hand, that we uniquely have constitutional development over time, even if there are no amendments. Insofar that institutions that are centered around the constitutions develop themselves over time. Look at the Madison case of the US Supreme Court, which granted themselves the right to constitutional review, thereby holding other branches in check. We also say uniquely precedent of courts develops these laws. Look at Brown v. Board of Education, in which educational segregation was ended. They say, well, judges are not representative. First of all, we say, as I explained, the representative is not relevant when we're talking about protecting backbone rights. But second, we say that judges are the way of more likely to protect individual rights than politicians. First of all, judges are often well-educated people that tend to be more liberal, tend to be more protective of individual rights. Second, they are not subjective to populist wave. Note that uniquely targets the most vulnerable, because even if you're incredibly vulnerable and people don't want you to have individual rights, politicians won't grant you them, judges will. But third, note it's simply a feeling of duty. Broadly, judges feel a duty to protect the Constitution. That's why even the very conservative Supreme Court now rejected an appeal to end Roe v. Wade by Louisiana just like 2 months ago. But even if you don't believe any of that, we say our third argument to explain becomes a media circus. We say if you look at how elections are circuses now, that's what you get. Political polarization, where you don't pass any of the reforms they want. It becomes showbiz politicians that pass bad laws because they think that makes them popular, and that they don't have to take a stance against those laws. We say incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank the third opposition speaker for that speech. We now move on to the concluding reply speeches, and I'd like to welcome the opposition reply. Yeah.
If tomorrow 51% of the population woke up and wanted to execute an ethnic minority and they had full parliamentary support, they would never be able to do that because we have an ironclad, stable constitution that restricts the fluctuating and uncertain will of the political majority. On their side, you leave it up to either having a political majority that those people like Biden in, or a political majority that allows a tyrannical leader to rule the country, like someone like Trump. We tell you that is what we prevent on our side when it's much more stable, when we have constitutions that have evolved over a long period of time. Proposition tries to have their cake and eat it too. They say constitutions need to change, but at the same time, they say the good egalitarian constitutions we have on our side stay the same. This puts them in a double bind. If constitutions change on their side, you risk the loss of good egalitarian values we uphold on ours. However, if constitutions don't change on their side, none of their positive impacts happen. Panel, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The vast majority of constitutions we already have are good. Just because #MeToo is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution does not mean there aren't stable clauses that undeniably state everyone should be treated equally and that women have the right to bodily autonomy, and therefore violating that is a crime. We told you through the context of these constitutions' establishments and through the time spans they have to grow and improve, constitutions are currently great ultimate values to support minorities and those who aren't represented in the majority of society. That is to say, if 51% of the political majority doesn't support gay marriage, on our side, the queer community can sue to show it's unconstitutional, which they did, which is why gay marriage is now legal in the US, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Canada, all constitutional democracies that have empowered minorities because of how stable they were. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And especially don't leave it up to the arbitrary timeframes where maybe someone like Trump has the political majority of political support, meaning they can make an oppressive constitution, which is bad because then we lose what we already have. But on a more important note, on their side, a bad constitution means people can be oppressed for 30 years without being able to change it because it's fixed. On our side, you can still propose an amendment bill, but you probably won't because it's not needed, because the changes that need to be made in the Constitution have already been made. Constitutional democracies weren't born yesterday. They've grown, evolved, and learned from their mistakes. We have centuries worth of constitutional development and improvement, which proposition risks backtracking and completely eradicating that entire process of growth when you can literally erase everything that has been done before and forcing people to just deal with it for 30 years. But even if Prop thinks it's so important to achieve change, they never show why we can't do that with amendments. Or even more simply, if they say, okay, but people now want change, they can get change through policies and through legislation. Their positive impacts aren't exclusive. Panel, when the replies are done and you look at your notes, you will see that everything proposition thinks can improve in our society can be done regardless of whether or not they have this fixed date convention. At that point, the comparative is that there are good egalitarian constitutions we have that have had centuries to develop, be tested, and improve, which is lost on their side when firstly, a non-equitable oppressive political majority, like those who elected Trump, those who elected Isaac Herzog, or those who elected Boris Johnson, can destroy carefully crafted clauses that can no longer protect equal rights for everyone on our side. But secondly, every time new clauses begin to grow, you torpedo that when you hit the reset button every 20 years, meaning constitutions never have time to mature. As demonstrated in our second argument, court precedent, internal legislation, judicial rights have developed over time and are central to keeping other branches in check. For example, without current judicial review structures, the court couldn't have found that gay marriage bans are unconstitutional. That entire system is derailed the moment the Constitution changes constantly. Then we told you as well, Constitution set important legal precedent that shapes our judicial system to be more progressive. Even if you believe change becomes a wash, you have much more negative externalities on their side, which is why you should definitely oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition reply speaker, and now to conclude the case for the proposition and the whole debate, welcome Prof reply. Thank you.
Hi, can you see and hear me like this? Team Netherlands have different stances on the Constitution. The first speaker says the Constitution is liberal and good, but the second speaker says they have legislative change, so they want to change the status quo as well. So they themselves disagree as to whether or not they want to maintain the status quo or change the status quo. But I don't think that's a contradiction. I think that's reflective of the will of the people. That change or maintenance could both be good decisions. That's the problem with the Netherlands case. Their burden was not to show you why the Constitution was good or bad, but to show you why their decision in this debate or their value judgment of whether or not the Constitution is good should be the permanent determinant. We say that's not a decision up to us, but a decision up to the will of truly all the people, all the electors involved, and therefore we should ask them to voice out their opinions every 20 years. There are three questions in this speech. Firstly, regarding consent, because all we've got were mitigatory responses, like representatives still can be fully representative, but there are more so when it is yourself voting versus your ancestors voting for representatives, when you can foresee just the next 20 years instead of making a decision that foresees the entirety of your life when the Constitution is going to be permanent. But third speaker poses a whole new question in opposition with, what's so unique about a Constitution? Why don't you revisit laws? We do revisit treaties and free trade agreements and all these things with a set time, but moreover, we told you why the Constitution is different from first and was never addressed, that this is the basis of your social contract versus laws are outcomes of the social contract where you already give up your power. Constitution outlines the most basic rules as to how you surrender over your autonomy and your freedoms, and if that isn't even up to the scrutiny of yourself and accountability, we don't know what should be, and that is the difference that they do not engage. So just on the fact that we don't impose things under the consent of the governed, we win. But secondly, let's talk about politics. The first thing I want to note is that all problems they identified undercut their very own case about organic change through court, organic change through legislature. Because if they say politicians are bad and abusive and racist, that's exactly why the legislature can just pass the Muslim ban, or Trump can issue decrees equally on their side. When they say there's going to be pushback from conservatives, when 51% of people wake up and want to persecute minorities, they can do so by imposing laws of segregation again if they want on their house as well. It is all equally symmetrical. So why does this problem actually not apply to our policy and not apply to the Constitution? It's exactly because of the lack of POI response we got from second speaker, that with the Republicans nowadays just get rid of the 14th Amendment that gave everyone equal rights. They said it wouldn't change, which shows you that because of the fact that constitutions outline very universal principles as they characterize, that it is usually going to be sustained in most cases as well. So if it's good, if it ain't broke, we wouldn't fix it either. But the difference is they can see that there are some cases in which things should be fixed, and therefore they have amendment practices in place as well to propose amendments. So if we prove to you that in these cases where things need to change, amendments are insufficient, we get those better changes that are actually needed, and that's why we win. We told you why it's insufficient. One, because on their side, the Constitution seems too holy, seems too permanent, and therefore amendments will get huge pushbacks automatically. And two, the fact that the political efficiency of proposing a single amendment is not worth it versus we force them to do this on our side of the House. These are reasons why amendments are not enough. But moreover, they don't address our mechanisms. They just say LGBTQ individuals or women can sue. Yes, but when they're suing, they get a more direct amendment if current day social movements can pressure to include women in the Constitution and not cite a very tenuous link from the right to searches and seizures that can be overturned any day. Suing and all these mechanisms get better on our side of the House. We think that on their side, this is not just about progressive policies either. There are archaic questions that don't answer. Why the Electoral College is still relevant, why our gun law still should be the same when AK-47s came about, and why is the current legislature on privacy in the Constitution enough when the internet exists. There are archaic things that they do not address, and we need to keep up with the times. Lastly, on discussion, like they think it's going to be made a spectacle because of televisation and therefore polarized. One, very symmetrical to passing laws in the legislature that they support, but two, it is good because if we get spotlight onto gun rights and abortion debates, it is good because debates become better on our side house as well, and we actually lend spotlight to these good debates. They don't respond why they like the right wing can't just cite the Second Amendment like they do in the status quo because the Second Amendment is not an automatic good. We're revisiting the Second Amendment, and therefore we present real arguments, not just assertions from the past. Constitutions have always been the political will of the people. On their side, it is the will of anyone who happened to be in a tennis court in the French Revolution and the will of Virginian politicians during 1783. Versus on our side, it is the will of everyone. And we can scrutinize and check it every 20 years. So mistakes will be inevitably made at some point. At least we have the time to fix it. We're so proud to propose.
Thank the proposition reply for that speech, and indeed all speakers. So what was an enjoyable debate. The panel and I will now go deliberate and fill out